when you're confronted with situations of injustice, you can ignore it, you can complain about it, or you can work on changing it. And personally, I prefer to do that.
Welcome to the Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. When Ben & Jerry's ice cream held its annual Free Cone Day in April, it had to contend with an unlikely protester. Ben Cohen, the company's co-founder, was standing on the site of the original scoop shop in Burlington and urging customers to free Ben & Jerry's. Cohen founded the ice cream company with his friend Jerry Greenfield nearly 50 years ago. The two men ran the company until 2000, when it was acquired by Unilever, a multinational company that owns Dove soap, Hellmann's mayonnaise, and Vaseline, to name a few. Ben & Jerry succeeded in getting Unilever to agree that the iconic Vermont company could continue to pursue its social mission, which would be overseen by an independent board. Cohen and Greenfield would remain as employees of the company, but they had no management authority. The company continued to be a strong supporter of racial justice, LGBTQ rights, the Occupy Wall Street movement, and climate activism, among other issues. But relations between the ice cream company and its corporate masters began to fray, then broke apart in 2021 when Ben & Jerry's announced it would stop selling ice cream in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Unilever opposed the move, then sold its Israeli business to an Israeli-owned company that has continued to sell the ice cream in Israel and the West Bank. Ben & Jerry's sued Unilever in 2024, accusing it of muzzling the company's support for Palestinian rights and silencing its criticism of President Donald Trump. In March 2024, Unilever spun off its ice cream businesses to Magnum, which is now one of the largest ice cream companies in the world. The hippie-themed Vermont brand may be associated with advocating for peace and love, but that does not characterize its current relations with Magnum. In September 2025, Jerry Greenfield quit the company that is co-named for him in protest. Ben, who is 75, is now waging a battle to save the soul of Ben & Jerry's and possibly buy it back, though Magnum says the company is not for sale. I spoke with Ben Cohen this week. Ben Cohen, welcome to the Vermont Conversation.
Yeah, good to be here, David.
So, Ben, you've been a champion of the socially responsible business movement, the idea that business can be a force for good. Why don't we start by just saying, what do you feel like has been your biggest accomplishment and that movement's biggest accomplishment?
Well, I think that Ben & Jerry's has been in the forefront of socially responsible business. I think that we were a pioneer, along with a few others, like the Body Shop and Patagonia and Seventh Generation back in the day. And it's beautiful to see that that movement has grown and blossomed. It's become the whole B Corporation movement, which is beautiful to see. There's 10,000 B Corps around the country. Beautiful to see, that Patagonia has now become owned by the earth, pretty much. Dr. Bronner's is another company that I've admired quite a bit. They've grown a whole lot more. They're no longer the little hippie soap company, and it's amazing to be able to marry this what has really become the most powerful force in our society, business, with social justice. So I'm proud of that, and I'm trying to keep it alive at Ben & Jerry's.
So we're having this conversation because that whole movement is probably under the greatest strain and challenge that it's ever faced. And we're seeing that under Trump, businesses are outdoing themselves to abandon DEI initiatives and other social justice programs. What does it say about the lasting impact of the socially responsible business movement that it finds itself, including some of the socially responsible business companies are also retreating on these things, keeping their head down. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not really aware of say Dr. Bronner's or Patagonia keeping their head down. I mean, what I am aware of is that uh, I was so excited and enthused. I mean, it was a really sad time after the murder of George Floyd, but it was beautiful to see all these corporations making these statements and commitments about how they were going to start hiring more black people, how they were going to diversify their supplier base, how banks were going to start loaning to people that they had been discriminating against in the past. And so I was very encouraged. And then when Trump came in and all these companies threw out all those commitments to DEI, what it said to me was that the companies never really embraced it. It was just kind of an add-on because it was trendy, or they thought their customers kind of demanded it. But I think that for the true believers, the companies that truly have embraced these values, I don't think they're pulling back from it. I mean, there is a particular problem that we're having at Ben and Jerry's, but when there were these companies that just started falling all over themselves, doing or not doing whatever Trump wanted or didn't want, I was trying to figure out what the heck's going on here, and then I realized that for companies that do not have any values except for maximizing short-term profits, it was a very easy decision. If the guy in the White House says do this, and you think you're going to make more money if you do that, you do it. But the key is to have values as part of your mission. And certainly for Ben and Jerry's, that was the big innovation for Ben and Jerry's back in the 1980, and values. This three-part mission statement that one third of the mission is to solve social problems, and so what can I say? Ben and Jerry's itself has not given up on that, but the owner of Ben and Jerry's, Magnum, the Magnum Corporation, which owns about 100 different ice cream brands around the world, has prevented Ben and Jerry's from acting on its values, and has destroyed the governance structure, the legally mandated governance structure.
Well,
That
let's talk
keep
about
the
that,
values
because
alive.
right, that's the piece that's so unusual about the Ben and Jerry's acquisition by Unilever back in 2000. How did you bake in the social mission in that deal? Because it was fairly unprecedented.
Yes, it was unprecedented. At the time, neither Jerry nor I wanted to sell Ben and Jerry's. It was a publicly held company, and Unilever was offering so much more money for the stock that, according to SEC rules, the company had to be sold. But there were other suitors. There were other companies besides Unilever that wanted to buy it, and Unilever really wanted it. and they came to understand that what would make their bid most attractive was if there was a way of maintaining the social mission, because that was what was the most important to Jerry and myself. And so we tried writing the social mission into the purchase and sales agreement and discovered that the problem was that the social mission had to evolve. It needs to keep on changing as the environment, as the society that it's in keeps on changing. And the way we found to do that was to establish an independent board of directors for Ben and Jerry's, whose purpose is to be the guardians of the social mission and to direct and drive the social mission, as well as being responsible for the quality of the ice cream. And what happened was when Magnum became the new owner, they fired the long-term employee, a 30-year employee who had worked his way up from tour guide to CEO, and they fired him because he was respecting the authority of the independent board. And then they went and dismantled the entire independent board. It's illegal, and it's currently in the courts, but they're refusing to meet with the independent board. And they've prevented the company from calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. They prevented the company from supporting the student protesters. And they've prevented the company from using the word Trump in its posts. I mean, this is a company that's called out presidents and politicians against going to war, and in favor of voting rights, and as a matter of fact, actually called out Trump by name his first time around. But I don't know. Magnum has become Trumpified, or they're not willing to to engage in anything that creates controversy. And as I've always said, if everybody already agrees with the stand that you're taking, you didn't need to take that stand.
Well, I did review Ben and Jerry's postings, and from afar, it might look like no, they're still out there swinging. They have some posts criticizing, the funding for ICE, things like that. But then you look more closely and you see that they are blaming a House-passed bill that funds ICE and the House that did this and that. And to your point, they do not mention the source of these things, which is Donald Trump. And it's, you can go through, listeners can go through those posts and see this for themselves, the sort of contortions that they do to never name Donald Trump. But I want to go to, you've mentioned the various causes that Ben and Jerry's has advocated post George Floyd for racial justice, civil rights, LGBTQ rights. You could pretty much pick and choose the issues you cared about until 2021. The one issue that crossed a line for Unilever was advocacy for Palestinian rights. What did you advocate then, and how did Unilever respond at that time?
Well, it's interesting. The issue of the illegal settlements in the West Bank had been something that the independent board and the company had been discussing for I don't know, a couple of years, and there were trips to the area to research what was going on, and a lot of conversation, and there was a belief that continuing to have our ice cream sold in the settlements in the occupied territories violated the values of Ben and Jerry's. And eventually the board and the management of Ben and Jerry's and Unilever agreed that Ben and Jerry's should pull out of the West Bank. But what happened was, as soon as that was announced, Israel got kind of upset, and we hear that the head of Israel called the head of Unilever and said, "If you don't get that ice cream back here, we're going to kick out all the Unilever businesses from Israel." And so Unilever at that time made a unilateral decision to sell the rights to Ben and Jerry's to an Israeli, and that was illegal. And that was usurping the authority of the board, and so the board sued them at the time.
Explain this little maneuver. The selling it to an Israeli enabled what to happen?
Well, it enabled the ice cream to still be available in Israel, and Unilever could say, well, it doesn't have anything to do with us because we don't own it, because we've sold the rights to it.
And as I recall, it is the pint containers are all in Hebrew letters now. So
That's
is
right.
that sort of a workaround that they have?
Yeah, that was part of the deal. I mean, I wasn't part of negotiating that, so I don't know exactly how that happened.
So Magnum says that it is actually strengthening the social mission of Ben and Jerry's. What's your response?
Yeah, that's what kind of drives me up a wall. I mean, that's what I don't know what really got my goat. Is that what they call it? That they put out a press release that says that they're enhancing the governance, and the reality is, at the end of that press release, they say, and we're getting rid of the entire independent board, which is responsible for the social mission. So, I mean, I called that statement Orwellian, that they're saying they're making it better, but they're actually making it worse. I mean, I've been doing these social media videos, and in a coming one, we're talking about how the Magnum guys are saying, hey, we got a real problem with this brand. The problem is its heart. We say, and they come up with a solution. We say we're gonna help improve the heart, but we're actually gonna remove it, and then they actually pull it out. So that's kind of what's going on.
So last year you launched the Free Ben and Jerry campaign. What are you calling for?
We're calling for, obviously, since Magnum is not willing to abide by a legally binding contract and is not and does not support the social mission, we're calling for them to sell Ben and Jerry's to a group of socially aligned investors that do support the social mission. And when Unilever first announced that they wanted to spin off their entire ice cream division, Jerry and I went to them and said, hey, why don't you just separate out Ben and Jerry's so we can sell it to people who actually believe in the mission? And, Unilever refused at that time, but we were very public about it, and a bunch of socially aligned investors appeared, and they're ready to buy the company. The problem is that Unilever or that Magnum now is not willing to sell it. And so the Free Ben and Jerry's campaign is designed to put some pressure on Magnum in order to get them to see the light, help them to see the light. Because, I mean, just if you look at it from the point of view of money, which is the way they look at it, except they look at it in short-term money. But, they have investors that have paid a premium for this brand, for Ben and Jerry's, and the very thing that has built the brand, this values-led way of doing business, is the very thing that they're destroying. So they're taking this investment and reducing the value of it.
What would it cost? I hear numbers like $1 billion is the valuation of Ben and Jerry's. Are you actually able to raise that kind of money?
Well, that's certainly not the financial realms that I myself deal in, but apparently there are other people and there are funds, family offices that are tend to be kind of some of which are values led, pension funds, and those are the places where the money would be coming from.
Are you calling for a boycott of Ben and Jerry's while this dispute is going on?
That is in the offing. I would say that, yeah, that is what we're planning to do, because we've kind of asked nicely, and we've been totally shut down, and so now, well, what's happened is that people hear about what's going on, and they say, wow, should I boycott Ben and Jerry's? And I say, no, you shouldn't boycott Ben and Jerry's. Ben and Jerry's is the victim here. But then I realized that, well, Magnum owns a whole lot of other brands, and you could boycott them. So, Magnum owns Popsicle, they own Good Humor, they own Breyers, they own Talenti, they own Klondike, they own Yasso. So, I'm not buying any of those products. And I would suggest that nobody else buy them either.
But are you buying? Well, of course, you probably don't have to buy Ben and Jerry's, but does your call for boycotting extend to Ben and Jerry's?
No, absolutely not. I mean, a boycott of Ben and Jerry's would be harmful to the people who work at Ben and Jerry's. I mean, harmful to the brand itself, and there's no reason to stop buying Ben and Jerry's. We want to support Ben and Jerry's. That's the issue. But to stop buying the other stuff that Magnum makes a lot of sense to me.
So, also part of that original agreement and the original brand was a commitment to sourcing most, I think originally all of the dairy from Vermont. I understand now it's not just Vermont, but it is still Ben and Jerry's buys a lot of dairy produced by Vermont dairy farmers. Do you think that that agreement is also in jeopardy and that Ben and Jerry's might leave Vermont?
It's possible. The reality of the rest of Magnum's brands that they own is that they're not located in a particular place. They don't have any association with a particular place. And they're all administered out of Magnum central offices. They don't have separate offices for the brand like they do for Ben and Jerry's. And they have a lot of ice cream plants around the country and the world, and I and I can tell you that it was the independent board that made sure that the plant in Waterbury was not closed. There was an effort on the part of Unilever to close that plant. Close. So I think that is. I don't know what's in Magnum's mind, but I don't think there would be anything to prevent them from doing that.
If you were lecturing other would-be or aspiring social entrepreneurs, what would you tell them to do differently about protecting their social mission and their brand that you didn't do?
Since Ben and Jerry's, formed, there have been new business structures that have been created. Uh, a lot of it as a result of people seeing what happened with Ben and Jerry's. So there's B corporations that legally require to take into account the benefit of the community. And there are new legal structures that are designed to be a lot more, enforceable and effective than the one that we put into effect in when Ben and Jerry's was first founded, and then when we first went public, and then when we had this negotiation with Unilever. So there are lawyers now that specialize in these alternative legal structures, and I'd encourage people to use them and research it. Use AI for good. Use find out what the latest is.
Why did Jerry resign and you stay and fight?
Well, we both came to the same conclusion that there was no way that the social mission of Ben and Jerry's was going to survive under the current ownership. And Jerry is my best friend and an incredibly kind and compassionate individual who just hates conflict. I mean, it's a visceral, physical reaction that he has to conflict, and unfortunately, it is a fight to save Ben and Jerry's, and it's not something that he's able to do. And so he resigned in protest, and I said, I'm gonna do my best to keep the mission alive, because I think that Ben and Jerry's holds a particular place in the world of socially conscious business. It's a leader, and if that ends, it's a big, it's a real blow to the movement. And the other thing is that Ben and Jerry's, amazingly enough, has become a huge company. I mean, it's a $1 billion company, and it has a tremendous amount of power, and it can use that power for justice, for on many forms of environmental or racial or economic justice, and it can continue to go on and campaign and be in a leadership position on those issues. And it as a business, as a for-profit business, it adds a lot of credibility to people that are trying to fight for those, for those, I don't know what should be human rights.
Last year, you were arrested and hauled out of a Senate hearing in Washington, D.C., where Robert F. Kennedy was testifying. What were you protesting then?
What happened for me, everybody's got their breaking point. And for me, I was following two news items. One was that there was a new outbreak of lead poisoning somewhere in the Midwest. I think it was, I don't know, Milwaukee or Minnesota. And lead poisoning kind of drives me crazy because it's a lifelong thing. There's nothing you can do for a little kid who got lead poisoning, that their brain is compromised for the rest of their lives. And we know what causes it. We know what to do about it. I mean, it's chipping lead paint in their low rent apartments. And we refuse to spend the money to do that, and instead we spend the money to buy bombs to give as a gift to Israel to kill little kids there. So those two things were going on in my head, and I said, I got to do something. I got to make the strongest statement that a citizen can make, which is to commit civil disobedience. And so I ended up at that hearing that Robert Kennedy was at, and they're talking about cutting SNAP benefits and throwing kids off healthcare programs. And so that's what I said, that the country is taking food and healthcare from kids in our country and using that money to kill kids in Gaza.
You recently said that you've given up on the Party. Why?
Because I think that both parties don't really care about regular old everyday people, especially people that are at the lower end of the economic spectrum. I mean, in terms of war and outrageous sums of money to being spent on preparing to kill literally millions of people, both parties are horrible. In terms of the economic structure of the company of the country that, as we see, has driven all this money to the top 1,000, to the richest 1,000 people in the country. I mean, I was just listening to a speech by Bernie last night. I mean, he's saying that the top 1,000 richest people in the country own as much as the bottom, I don't know. I mean, I think he said 90%. I don't know. I might have my numbers wrong a little, but it's absurd. They both parties have presided over this system that drives all this money up to the top, and it's structural. It's like the system isn't broken, it's fixed. The system is working the way it's designed, and both parties are guilty of that.
So you have been at this a long time. Ben and Jerry's has been around almost 50 years. You've been active for all of that time. And hearing you talk is to hear the way a lot of people with conscience and who care and are paying attention are talking. And I'm wondering, how do you keep despair and apathy from taking over?
Well, who was it who said, Joan Baez, I think she said that action is the antidote to despair. That's what works for me is working to change it. I think that I would be more in despair if I weren't working to change it. I mean, I feel like when you're confronted with situations of injustice, you can ignore it, you can complain about it, or you can work on changing it. And personally, I prefer to do that.
And when you look out into the world right now, where do you see the hope? What keeps you going?
Well, I look at Bernie and I'm very hopeful. I look at Zoran Mandani and I'm incredibly hopeful. I look at Plattner, the guy who's running for, I don't know, Congress or Senate in Maine, and I'm hugely hopeful. I mean, as Bernie was pointing out last night, when Mamdani first started running, he was at 1% in the polls. No one had ever heard of him. But then when they heard about what he was advocating for economic justice, essentially, he won by a landslide. And it was kind of the same with Bernie. I mean, the first time he won an election in Burlington, it wasn't exactly a landslide. He won by 10 votes. But it was because he went door to door and told people what he was planning on doing. And he was trying to help regular, everyday people. I mean, most of the country is regular, everyday people. These politicians, Bernie and Zoran and Platner, and there's a bunch more. I mean, they're sincere about it. Trump was kind of saying the same thing during the election campaign. He was just lying like he does.
Well, Ben Cohen, I want to thank you for joining us on the Vermont Conversation and for some fabulous ice cream and great causes that you've been put out in the world all these years.
Well, really good talking to you, David. Thanks for having me on the show.
Ben Cohen is the co-founder with Jerry Greenfield of Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. That does it for this week's Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Thanks so much for listening.